Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amelia, and today I want to talk a little bit about the books that I read growing up that made me into the reader that I am today. And I originally saw Carrie Can Read do this video, pretty much the same concept, on her channel, and so I thought it would be really interesting to talk about my experience and the books that I read. A lot of what I read was similar. I mean, she's only a few years older than me, so we have kind of a similar experience, but I was a little bit younger and read, I think, a few different things from her, or at least have a different experience with them. So I thought, yeah, let's talk about that today and see how I went from a wee lass to an adult fantasy reader. Alright, so the first series that I remember having like a large impact on my taste in reading both then and now as I have become an adult is the Magic Treehouse series. I just looked up this series while I was preparing this, and it looks like they're actually still publishing books in this series, which is honestly kind of insane. So I know if I ever have a kid, I can give them Magic Treehouse and they'll be set, because there's got to be like so many books in that series by now. I think I probably had like at least 15 of these books, so I don't even want to know how many there are now. But this was probably my like first real taste of fantasy. Like these are pretty young grade books, probably some of my first like chapter books. So before that it would have been like, like toddler books or whatever. So these are probably A, some of my first chapter books, and B, some of my first like experiences with fantasy outside of like Disney movies. And honestly, I think it's probably not insignificantly irresponsible for my love of fantasy as a genre, whether that's in books or movies or games. Like I think it probably contributed quite a bit to that. It's about these two kids and they find this magic treehouse, as the name would suggest, and it can transport them to the past. And most of the books are just kind of like episodic, like they're not a through story, but there was one set that did have a through story, and I do remember these ones being my favorite. It's like an Arthurian legend type of story that I really loved. Although I did kind of tend to choose the books by like the cover or the title, so I read a bunch of them out of order, I'm pretty sure, and I remember being kind of confused by that. Like, what is happening again? I don't even know. And then I would have to try to like look in the front covers and be like, okay, what was the order that these are meant to actually go in? Because I'm not quite sure what's happening here. And then after those books, the next series slash book that I want to talk about is something we don't talk about it that much anymore on account of the author having some pretty bigoted opinions. But of course, it is Harry Potter. I can't talk about the books that I read growing up without talking about it. It was a huge part of my life, and also just like the culture at the time. I think for people who are kids like now or more recently, or people who didn't read it or wasn't involved with it growing up, it's kind of a little bit hard to understand like the vibe of it all. Like it was such a thing when the Harry Potter books were coming out. Like you've heard of people lining up for movies, but people were lining up to go to the midnight releases of these books. I mean, I personally didn't go. I was a little bit younger when the first few were coming out, so I was a little bit behind on that, but my partner went, and it was like a whole thing. Now the first book was released the year I was born, so obviously I wasn't reading that like right away, but I did catch up through a mixture of reading them myself as I got a little bit older and having them read to me. So I was like caught up for like the last few books. Although I was looking at the release dates and it's like, damn, I swear I remember being older when those were coming out, but no, the last one came out in like 2007, so I was like 10. So it seems crazy that I was reading that then. But I think one of the main strengths of the books was that you're following Harry from the young age of 11 up to the age of 17, and the books sort of matured with Harry and with the audience, so you were able to keep your audience from that very first book to the end as they like got increasingly like darker, I guess you could say, because I feel like with a lot of, if she had stayed at the very sort of middle grade type of vibe that the first book was, obviously by the time she reached the last book her audience would have aged out of it. But because the tone of the book changed with Harry's age, it really worked out and kept that same core audience while you are adding on more and more audience. but being able to keep that audience, I think just was like probably one of the main reasons that it was so successful. And it was really one of the first kind of YA fantasy series that like had such massive success. Obviously it's probably one of the most successful series ever. Well, I don't know what the most successful series ever is. It might be Harry Potter. It made so much money. All in all, it was a really sort of special era and chunk of time that I don't think will probably ever, at least in my lifetime, be replicated. Just like everybody was interested, not even just like kids, like their parents were reading it too. So I don't know. It's hard to describe. It was just sort of a cultural moment that unfortunately you kind of had to be there for. But yeah, it has been unfortunately tarnished, but I do believe that you can separate the artist from the art to a degree and still enjoy the memories that you have of reading that series, of being with that series and the characters, and recall it with a fondness and without associating her with it to a degree. I mean, obviously art is going to be representative of the artist in some aspects, but I don't think it's fair to let her ruin your memories of your childhood, I guess. Now, obviously, I was reading other stuff while the Harry Potter series was releasing. Another of the big hitters for me around the sort of middle age genre / time of my life, not middle age, middle grade, that's the word, middle aged, oh my god, was the Warrior Cats series. Now, this was an obsession that first started when I pilfered some books from my sister's shelf, which was kind of a theme. You know, we only had so many books in the house, so it's like, okay, I've read all of my books, now I'm going to steal from somebody else's shelf. But she had one of the like sub-series, like it was published in like mini series, well, not specifically mini, but like there were sets of 6 books, and there would sometimes be like a time skip between them, or it would be like right after but from another perspective or whatever. And there were so many of these books. I think by the time that we like grew out of it, we probably had like close to 20 of these books. It was actually insane how many of them there were. And I think they're also still publishing in that series, or at least in that kind of, there was like a sister series called Seekers. I think it was Bears. I don't think it did as well. So if they're still publishing, it's probably under the Warrior Cats thing. It's kind of funny actually, because looking at it now, it's like, oh, it was kind of just like a political sort of story, like not specifically fantasy, but just like politics that were like reskinned into cats in their different clans, and sort of how they interacted with each other and the tensions that existed there. And it was just, yeah, it's kind of strange thinking about it now, but I really enjoyed it at the time. And if you're not familiar with the series, it follows these 4 clans that originally live in a forest, and they have their shared borders or whatever, and they have disputes and things happen. And yeah, but that's the core of it, is that there are 4 clans of cats, and this is like their relationships between them. And the main clan was ThunderClan, I believe. Yes, ThunderClan. There was ThunderClan, RiverClan, WindClan, and ShadowClan, I think. Yeah. And my sister and I love this series so much that like we had this pile of cinder blocks that were just like a leftover from like some sort of construction thing. I don't know exactly. It might have been our house. I don't know. But we used them to build our own little like cat, what are they calling them? They call them camps, I think. Yeah, we built our own camp, and we also had like a bundle of shingles, so we like roofed all these little buildings and built our own little cat colony. We even had the medicine cat's den, the leader's den, you know, warrior's den, all that fun stuff. And honestly, our barn cats actually did love it, but I think that probably has more to do with the fact that shingles get nice and toasty in the sunlight than that they thought they were clan cats or anything like that. But you know, we can always choose to believe what we want to. All right, next we have The Hobbit. I didn't read The Hobbit myself until I was a little bit older, but my parents did used to read to us every night, and we weren't too old, I don't think, when my dad read us The Hobbit for the first time. And strangely enough, this actually didn't like trigger like a Lord of the Rings obsession or anything, but I think it might partially also be because like I don't know if I was aware that the story of the ring continued after The Hobbit at that point. Like it was just like, ooh, this is like a good story, I like this. And I didn't go on to do anything more with that. But I mean, Lord of the Rings is of course a lot more adult, so for like a young child who's having The Hobbit read to them, they're not gonna go and pick up Fellowship of the Ring the next day. And fun fact, I actually watched the Lord of the Rings movies before I read the books, which I know it's blasphemous, but I mean, watching those movies I think was what inspired me to actually go and read the books. So, I'll take it. And to this day, I think that trilogy is my favorite series of movies ever made. And I think Fellowship, is my favorite out of the three. Although I do love the battle scenes in the second one. But I think it's going to have to be Fellowship for my favorite. All right, and then some other things that I read during that time that probably impacted my reading, but I don't have like strong memories of / feel the need to discuss them more in depth include Artemis Fowl, which was like a fae type book, but it was like set in the real world, but there was like also like a fae world, and Artemis Fowl, who was like some rich boy, and I don't really remember what happens. We were supposed to get a movie at one point, but then that never happened. And then I don't know if I read this whole series, but I know I read the first book, and that was Terrier by Tamora Pierce. I just remember, I couldn't remember what it was called. I had to Google. It's like book where they call people dogs, and the girl's name is Becca. So that's pretty much all that I remember about that book. I think I may have only read the first one, but like the book like cover was standing out in my mind, so I had to feel like I had to mention it. And then there was also the Golden Compass series. I don't know if I ever finished that one either, but I did read at least a couple of them. I remember there being a polar bear and a golden compass, of course. And then also there was Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. This is one where there's like, I think a bunch of people have different powers, but there's specifically this girl who can like pull, I think, characters out of stories. And again, I don't really remember the plot, but there was something about her mother being missing. And also when I was looking it up for this video, I discovered that there's apparently a movie. So I don't know, let me know in the comments if I should watch that. But I feel like it's probably not good. But sometimes not good movies are still good in their own way. All right, now we're sort of in the advanced middle grade / YA category. I think it's probably more YA. I don't know if I would call any of these middle grade. But it's like did I say the time? I don't know if I said, okay. So it's like the late 2000s, early 2010s. And honestly, when I was researching like the release dates and stuff for this, I was like, oh damn. I was a lot younger than I thought when some of these were coming out. Now granted, I didn't read all of these like right at release date. Some of them I read like when the whole series was completed or like a couple of years later. So not all of them are like being read on release. So for example, the final Twilight book came out when I was like 11. I'm pretty sure I wasn't reading that at 11, or at least I hope not. Like I might have been. I don't even honestly know. But the heavy hitters for this era were probably Eragon, which is called the Inheritance Cycle, like the whole series is. Shadowhunters, specifically this was kind of when Mortal Instruments was coming out. Hunger Games and Twilight. Those are kind of the main like big things that were coming out at this time, and yeah, I read all of them, of course. Honestly, this was kind of a great era for like literature that was more aimed at a slightly younger audience, like teens. Is new adult older than young adult? I think it is. So it would be young adult, and some of these were on like the very sort of young end of young adult, so I'm not really up to speed with that too much these days because I am a little bit old for that. But I remember my mom reading like all of these sort of young adult books that we were reading, and she didn't necessarily like them all, but like she liked enough that she had read most of them, and so my sister, her and I could kind of discuss all the books that we read because there was only so many books in the house to read. This was pre like Kindle / Kobo era, and we did have a library nearby, but it's kind of easier when you finish a book to like look around the house and be like, I haven't read that one yet, so you read it, even if it's like not your like favorite genre. Like my mom will read anything you put in front of her for the most part. I mean, sometimes she'll give up, but she'll try everything. And it was also a lot more rereading happening, I think, at this time, at least in our household. I know that we had a couple of Harry Potter books that like literally fell apart at the spine into multiple chunks because they had been read and reread so many times. And it's interesting how little rereading I do now. Like, obviously, it's so much easier to get my hands on books because I can get them digitally. Not that I do, but it's easy for me to go to the library whenever I want now. And you can put digital holds in now. You couldn't do that then. So it's just like so much more accessible to find specific books and to find new books. You can look it up online and get recommendations that are likely to align with the other stuff you read. Like, it's crazy. When I was first going to the library as a kid, they were stamping your library thing. It had the little card, you know? Yeah. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but for the sake of the video. But yeah, I barely reread anything now, although I am currently rereading Assassin's Apprentice because I do want to change that to an extent, but at the same time, it's so exciting to pick up a new fantasy series and learn about the new rules and learn about the new worlds and the new characters and magic systems, and it's just like always so fun to dive into a new world. But there is, I think, a lot of value in revisiting books that you've read before. You get something new out of them every time, I think. I do kind of want to do a video talking about rereading and how it's sort of gone out of style. So let me know in the comments if you are interested in that. Alright, but let's talk about Eragon, or the Inheritance cycle. This was another big one in my fantasy journey. I think it was probably the first epic fantasy that I read on my own. Most of the middle grade books, they would be like, I don't know what you classify them as exactly, but they took place in the real world and they had like magical elements like the magic treehouse, that kind of thing. And so aside from The Hobbit, which was read to me, I don't think I'd read it by myself at that point yet, although maybe I had. I would say Eragon was probably my first epic fantasy. And I know people say that it's just like reskinned Star Wars, but I'm gonna drop a hot take here. I enjoyed it more than Star Wars. I think I was just like, by the time I actually watched Star Wars, I was a little bit older, probably like mid-teens or something like that. And I think I would have had to watch it as a kid in order to like really get into it, because at that time, special effects had kind of advanced quite a bit. So I was watching it and I was like, these effects kind of suck. And yeah, it wasn't the story for me. I definitely prefer the dragon version of Star Wars. So say what you want about it. I think it's a great fantasy for getting people into the genre. It gets like slightly more complex as the series goes on, but like not too much. And the first book is like pure classic pastoral fantasy vibes. We got our farm boy, he's going off on a hero's adventure, and it all really appealed to a young me. We won't talk about Palini's recent attempt to return to this world because I've already talked about that. And people have opinions. Alright, and then The Mortal Instruments was another series that I pilfered off my sister's bookshelves. And looking back, there are definitely some questionable things about this series. But was I questioning them at the time? No, not really. I was just kind of having a good time. I remember really liking the world building with the shadow hunters and all the different sort of, what do you call them? Supernatural, I guess? Like vampires, werewolves. They had a little bit of everything going on. I liked that about it, and I 100% wanted to be a shadow hunter. Or honestly, I just kind of wanted to be like a badass fighter of any kind. I was really into that kind of thing. And honestly, I probably should have been like a stunt woman. But I think this is one of my first introductions to a more romance-heavy type of book, which, oof. It must have scarred me because I don't really read romance at all anymore. Like, I don't mind it in my other books, but I prefer for it not to be like the main thing. Like, I prefer the fantasy plot to be like the main thing, and then the romance like kind of like down here. Alright, then we have The Hunger Games. So this was a series that I didn't read until after all of it was published, but I did read it before the movies came out, and I remember really enjoying it at the time, but I think I actually appreciate it more now. I remember reading Mockingjay as a kid, or like preteen, teen, whatever, and just thinking that Katniss was like sulking and being annoying. But now, looking back at that with like more perspective, like Katniss clearly had some major trauma going on, so obviously she was gonna be a bit out of sorts. But you know, that's youth for you. They don't always understand these type of things, but I think for the most part she did a pretty good job of putting that sort of thing in a way that kids can digest it. Well, not specifically kids, but like it's definitely YA, so like teenagers probably, I guess, but still when you're an adult and you read it, it's like, okay, you can pick up on a lot more things because you have more experience with society. And this was like the dystopian era when I was reading that, so I did go on to read a bit more dystopian after that. I know I read Divergent, which meh, and I read the first book in the Maze Runner series as well, but neither of those stuck with me anywhere close to the way that Hunger Games did. I actually reread them I think a couple of years ago now, and then I rewatched the movies last year. And the movies, they definitely don't go as hard on the political commentary as the books do, but I still think they're pretty well done. And they say some stuff, just like not as much. Also, I was definitely a more Gale type of person when I first read them, but now I hate Gale. I think you're actually supposed to not like Gale. Like, he is constantly trying to make it about himself and how Katniss should love him, while she's like dealing with the trauma of the games and also trying to like save the districts from the capital and grapple with like that kind of moral dilemma. And he's just like, why won't you kiss me? And so now when I read about him, I'm just like, oh, I hate you. And also he commits war crimes. So, alright, so Twilight. Twilight's kind of a strange one because I did read all the books and I watched all the movies. Like, I was there when it was all happening and I was participating, but it wasn't like a favorite of mine. I wouldn't say I was ever like a Twilight girly in the way that like some people were. Like, I was involved, but I wasn't like invested, is the best way I think I could put that. I don't know quite what it was about it. I think probably just at the fact that it was like a romance, and I think I was already going into my like, I want the fantasy elements to be above the romance elements, whereas that was like pure romance and then like paranormal. So I think it just wasn't quite the thing for me, but I do remember enjoying it at the time, although I think I recall thinking that Bella was kind of annoying as well. So I guess I just have it out for protagonists of that time. After that, I honestly don't even really know what I was reading. Like, there were those books and like their sequels kind of carried me into like early high school. At some point I read Lord of the Rings in there. But then I kind of stopped reading, and like not entirely, but for the most part, like I wasn't reading like a ton. Like, I'd maybe read a couple of books in a year on like a good year. And then up until like a couple of years ago when I stumbled across BookTube for the first time. And initially I was watching like general fiction, like Jack Edwards type stuff, but then I discovered fantasy BookTube, and it really reawakened my love for fantasy. I mean, as a genre, but specifically like reading fantasy books, and I got so much more into it. And now I'm here on BookTube myself, and hopefully my channel will inspire somebody else to get back into reading and to pick up fantasy and begin their reading journey anew. But yeah, that is all that I really want to talk about today. Let me know in the comments what books you were reading growing up, which ones had the biggest impact on you. But that is all we have time for today. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.